Chapter 41 of Esther Waters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Esther Waters by George Moore. Chapter 41. Next day the following account was given in most of the daily papers. Raid on a betting man in the West End. William Latch, 35, landlord of the King's Head, Dean Street, Soho, was charged that he, being a licensed person, did keep and use his public-house for the purpose of betting with persons resorting thereto. Thomas William, 35, billiard marker, Golden Street, Battersea. Arthur Henry Parsons, 25, waiter, Northumberland Street, Marylebone. Joseph Stack, 52, gentleman. Harold Journeyman, 45, gentleman, High Street, Norwood. Philip Hutchinson, grocer, Busy Road, Fulham. William Tan, piano tuner, Standard Street, Soho. Charles Ketley, butterman, Green Street, Soho. John Randall, Friss Street, Soho. Charles Muller, 44, tailor, Marylebone Lane. Arthur Bartram, stationer, East Street Buildings. William Burton, harness maker, Blue Lion Street, Bond Street, were charged with using the King's Head for the purpose of betting. Evidence was given by the police regarding the room upstairs, where a good deal of drinking went on after hours. There had been cases of disorder, and the magistrate unfortunately remembered that a servant girl, who had pledged her master's place to obtain money to back a horse, had been arrested in the King's Head. Taking these facts into consideration, it seemed to him that he could not do less than inflict the fine of £100. The men who were found in Latch's house he ordered to be bound over. Who had first given information? That was the question. Old John sat smoking in his corner. Journeyman leaned against the yellow-painted partition, his legs thrust out. Stack stood square, his dark crimson-tinted skin contrasting with sallow-faced little Ketley. "Don't the omens throw no light on this 'ere matter?" said Journeyman. Ketley started from his reverie. "Ah," said William, "if I only knew who the bastard was." "Ain't you got no idea of any sort?" said Stack. "There was a Salvation chap who came in some months ago and told me wife that the betting was corrupting the neighbourhood, that it would have to be put a stop to. It may have been he." "You don't ask no one to bet with you. They does as they like." "Does as they like? No one does that nowadays. There's a temperance party, a purity party, and a anti-gambling party, and what they's working for is just to stop folk from doing as they like." "That's it," said Journeyman. Stack raised his glass to his lips and said, "Here's luck." "There's not much of that about," said William. "We seem to be losing all round. I'd like to know where the money goes. I think it is the 'ouse it's gone unlucky, and I'm thinking of clearing out." "We may live in a 'ouse a long while before we find what its luck really is," said Ketley. "I've been in my old 'ouse these 20 years, and it ain't nothing like what I thought it." "You are superstitious," said Journeyman. "If there was anything the matter with the 'ouse, you'd have knowed it before now." "Ain't you doing the trade you was?" said Stack. "No, my butter and egg trade have fallen dreadful lately." The conversation paused. It was Stack who broke the silence. "Do you intend to do no more betting here?" he asked. "What, after being fined £100? You heard the way he went on about Sarah, and all on account of her being took here.
I think he might have left Sarah out." "It warn't for betting she took the plate," said Journeyman. "It was 'cause her chap said if she did he'd marry her." "I wonder if you ever left the course," said Stack. "It was on the account of my health. I caught a dreadful cold at Kempton. Standing about in the mud, I've never quite got over that cold." "I remember," said Ketley, "you couldn't speak above a whisper for 2 months." "2 months, more like 3."
14 weeks, said Esther. She was in favour of disposing of the house and going to live in the country, but it was soon found that the conviction for keeping a betting house had spoiled their chance of an advantageous sale. If, however, the licence were renewed next year, and the business did not in the meantime decline, they could be in a position to obtain better terms. So all their energies should be devoted to the improvement of their business. Esther engaged another servant, and she provided the best meat and vegetables that money could buy. William ordered beers and spirits of a quality that could be produced nowhere else in the neighbourhood, but all to no purpose. As soon as it became known that it was no longer possible to pass half a crown or a shilling wrapped up in a piece of paper across the bar, the custom began to decline. At last William could stand it no longer, and he obtained his wife's permission to once more begin bookmaking on the course. His health had begun to improve with the spring weather, and there was no use keeping him at home eating his heart out with vexation because they were doing no business. So did Esther reason, and it reminded her of old times when he came back with his race glasses slung round his shoulder. "Favourites all beaten to-day. What have you got for me to eat, old girl?" Esther forgot her dislike of racing in the joy of seeing her husband happy. If he'd only pick up a bit of flesh, but he seemed to get thinner and thinner, and his food didn't seem to do him any good. One day he came home complaining that the ring was 6 inches of soft mud. He was wet to the skin, and he sat shivering the whole evening, with the sensation of a long illness upon him. He was laid up for several weeks, and his voice seemed as if it would never return to him again. There was little or no occupation for him in the bar, and instead of laying he began to take the odds. He backed a few winners, it is true, but they could not rely on that. Most of their trade had slipped from them, so it did not much matter to them if they were found out. He might as well be hung for an old sheep as a lamb, and surreptitiously at first, and then more openly, he began to take money across the bar. And with every shilling he took for a bet, another shilling was spent in drink. Custom came back in ripples, and then in stronger waves, until once again the bar of the King's Head was full to overflowing. Another conviction meant ruin, but they must risk it, so said William. And Esther, like a good wife, acquiesced in her husband's decision. But he took money only from those whom he was quite sure of. He required an introduction, and was careful to make inquiries concerning every new backer. "In this way," he said to Ketley, "so long as one is content to bet on a small scale, I think it can be kept dark. But if you try to extend your connection, you're bound to come across a wrong 'un sooner or later. It was that room upstairs that did for me." "I never did think much of that room upstairs," said Ketley. "There was something about it that I didn't like. Be sure you never bet in that jug and bottle bar, whatever you do. There's just the same look there as in the room upstairs. Haven't you noticed it?" "Can't say I have, nor am I sure that I know exactly what you mean." "If you don't see it, you don't see it. But it's plain enough to me, and don't you bet with nobody standing in that bar.
I wouldn't go in there for a sovereign."
William laughed. He thought at first that Ketley was joking, but he soon saw that Ketley regarded the jug and bottle entrance with real suspicion. When pressed to explain, he told Journeyman that it wasn't that he was afraid of the place, he merely didn't like it.
"There's some places that you likes better than others, ain't they?"
Journeyman was obliged to confess that there were.
"Well, then that's one of the places I don't like. Don't you hear a voice talking there, a soft low voice with a bit of jeer in it?"
On another occasion he shaded his eyes and peered curiously into the left-hand corner.
"What are you looking at?" asked Journeyman. "At nothing that you can say," Ketley answered,
and he drank his whisky as if lost in consideration of grave and difficult things. A few weeks later they noticed that he always got as far from the jug and bottle entrance as possible, and he was afflicted with a long story concerning a danger that awaited him.
"He's waiting, but nothing will happen if I don't go in there. He can't follow me. He's waiting for me to go to him."
"Then keep out of his way," said Journeyman.
"You might ask your bloody friend if he can tell us anything about the legger."
"I'm trying to keep out of his way, but he's always watching and a-beckoning of me." "Can you see him now?" asked Stack.
"Yes," said Ketley. "He's sitting there, and he seems to say that if I don't come to him, worse will happen."
"Don't say nothing to him," William whispered to Journeyman. "I don't think he's quite right in the head. He's been losing a lot lately." One day Journeyman was surprised to see Ketley sitting quite composedly in the jug and bottle bar.
"He got me at last. I had to go. The whispering got so loud in my head as I was coming down the street. I tried to get out in the middle of the street, but a drunken chap pushed me across the pavement, and he was at the door waiting, and he said, 'Now you better come in. You know what will happen if you don't.'" "Don't talk rot, old pal. Come round and have a drink with us." "I can't just at present. I may later on."
"What do you mean?" said Stack.
"Lord, I don't know," said Journeyman. "It's only his wandering talk."
They tried to discuss the chances of the various horses they were interested in, but they could not detach their thoughts from Ketley, and their eyes went back to the queer little sallow-faced man who sat on a high stool in the adjoining bar, paring his nails. They felt something was going to happen, and before they could say the word he had plunged the knife deep into his neck and had fallen heavily on the floor. William vaulted over the counter. As he did so he felt something break in his throat, and when Stack and Journeyman came to his assistance he was almost as white as the corpse at his feet. Blood flowed from his mouth and from Ketley's neck in a deep stream that swelled into a great pool and thickened on the sawdust.
"I was jumping over that bar,"
William replied faintly. "I'll see to my husband," said Esther. A rush of blood cut short his words, and leaning on his wife he walked feebly round into the back parlour. Esther rang the bell violently. "Go round at once to Dr. Green," she said, "and if he isn't in, inquire which is the nearest. Don't come back without a doctor." William had broken a small blood vessel, and the doctor said he would have to be very careful for a long time. It was likely to prove a long case, but Ketley had severed the jugular at one swift keen stroke, and had died almost instantly. Of course there was an inquest, and the coroner asked many questions regarding the habits of the deceased. Mrs. Ketley was one of the witnesses called, and she deposed that he had lost a great deal of money lately in betting, and that he went to the King's Head for the purpose of betting. The police deposed that the landlord of the King's Head had been fined £100 for keeping a betting house, and the foreman of the jury remarked that betting houses were the ruin of the poor classes, and that they ought to be put a stop to. The coroner added that such places as the King's Head should not be licensed. That was the simplest and most effectual way of dealing with the nuisance.
"There never was no luck about this house," said William, "and what there was has left us. In 3 months' time we shall be turned out of it neck and crop. Another conviction would mean a fine of a couple of hundred, or most likely 3 months, and that would just about be the end of me."
"They'll never license us again," said Esther. "And the boy at school, and doing so well."
"I'm sorry, Esther, to have brought this trouble on you. We must do the best we can, get the best price we can for the house. I may be lucky enough to back a few winners, that's all there is to be said. The house was always an unlucky one. I hate the place, and should be glad to get out of it."
Esther sighed. She didn't like to hear the house spoken ill of, and after so many years it did seem a shame. End of chapter 41. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 42 of Esther Waters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Esther Waters by George Moore. Chapter 42. Esther kept William within doors during the winter months. If his health did not improve, it got no worse, and she had begun to hope that the breakage of the blood vessel did not mean lung disease. But the harsh winds of spring did not suit him, and there was business with his lawyer to which he was obliged to attend. A determined set was going to be made against the renewal of his license, and he was determined to defeat his opponents. Counsel was instructed, and a great deal of money was spent on the case, but the license was nevertheless refused, and the north-east wind did not cease to rattle. It seemed resolved on William's death, and with the sick husband on her hands, and all the money they had invested in the house irreparably lost, Esther began to make preparations for moving. William had proved a kind husband, and in the 7 years she had spent in the King's Head there had been some enjoyment of life. She couldn't say that she had been unhappy. She had always disapproved of the betting. They had tried to do without it. There was a great deal in life which one couldn't approve of, but Ketley had never been very right in his head, and Sarah's misfortune had had very little to do with the King's Head. They had all tried to keep her from that man. It was her own fault. There were worse places than the King's Head. It wasn't for her to abuse it. She had lived there 7 years. She had seen her boy growing up. He was almost a young man now, and had had the best education. That much good the King's Head had done, but perhaps it was no longer suited to William's health. The betting, she was tired thinking about that, and that constant nipping, it was impossible for him to keep from it with every one asking him to drink with them. A look of fear and distress passed across her face, and she stopped for a moment. She was rolling up a pair of curtains. She did not know how they were to live. That was the worst of it. If they only had back the money they had sunk in the house, she would not so much mind. That was what was so hard to bear. All that money lost, just as if they had thrown it into the river. 7 years of hard work, for she had worked hard, and nothing to show for it. If she had been doing the grand lady all the time, it would have been no worse. Horses had won and horses had lost, a great deal of trouble and fuss, and nothing to show for it. That was what stuck in her throat. Nothing to show for it. She looked round the dismantled walls, and descended the vacant staircase. She would never serve another pint of beer in that bar. What a strong big fellow he was when she first went to live with him. He was sadly changed. Would she ever see him strong and well again? She remembered he had told her that he was worth nearly £3,000. She hadn't brought him luck. He wasn't worth anything like that today. "How much have we in the bank, dear?"
A bit over £600. I was reckoning of it up yesterday. But what do you want to know for? To remind me that I've been losing? Well, I have been losing. I hope you're satisfied.
"I wasn't thinking of such a thing."
Yes, you was. There's no use saying you wasn't. It ain't my fault if the horses don't win. I do the best I can.
She did not answer him. Then he said,
"It's my health that makes me irritable, dear. You aren't angry, are you?"
"No, dear, I know you don't mean it, and I don't pay no attention to it." She spoke so gently that he looked at her surprised, for he remembered her quick temper, and he said,
"You're the best wife a man ever had."
"No, I'm not, Bill, but I tries to do my best." The spring was the harshest ever known, and his cough grew worse, and the blood-spitting returned. Esther grew seriously alarmed. Their doctor spoke of Brompton Hospital, and she insisted on his going there to be examined. William would not have her come with him, and she did not press the point, fearing to irritate him, but sat at home waiting anxiously for him to return, hoping against hope, for their doctor had told her that he feared very long trouble, and she could tell from his face and manner that he had bad news for her. All her strength left her, but she conquered her weakness and said, "Now tell me what they said. I've a right to know. I want to know."
"They said it was consumption."
"Oh, did they say that?"
"Yes, but they don't mean that I'm going to die. They said they hoped they could patch me up. People often live for years with only half a lung, and it is only the left one that's gone."
He coughed slightly and wiped the blood from his lips. Esther was quite overcome.
"Now, don't look like that," he said, "or I shall fancy I'm going to die tomorrow."
"They said they thought they could patch you up?"
"Yes, they said I might go on a long while yet, but that I would never be the man I was."
This was so obvious she could not check a look of pity.
"If you're going to look at me like that, I'd sooner go into the hospital at once. It ain't the cheerfulest of places, but it will be better than here."
"I'm sorry it was consumption, but if they said they could patch you up, it will be all right. It was a great deal for them to say." Her duty was to overcome her grief and speak as if the doctors had told him that there was nothing the matter that a little careful nursing would fail to put right. William had faith in the warm weather, and she resolved to put her trust in it. It was hard to see him wasting away before her eyes, and keep cheerful looks in her face, and an accent of cheerfulness in her voice. The sunshine which had come at last seemed to suck up all the life that was in him. He grew paler and withered like a plant. Then ill luck seemed to have joined in the hunt. He could not touch a winner, and their fortune drained away with his life. Favourites and outsiders, it mattered not. Whatever he backed lost. And Esther dreaded the cry,
"Winner, all the winner."
He sat on the little balcony in the sunny evenings, looking down the back street for the boy to appear with the special. Then she had to go and fetch the paper. On the rare occasions when he won, the spectacle was even more painful. He brightened up, his thin arm and hand moved nervously, and he began to make projects and indulge in hopes which he knew were vain. She insisted, however, on his taking regularly the medicine they gave him at the hospital, and this was difficult to do, for his irritability increased in measure as he perceived the medicine was doing him no good. He found fault with the doctors, railed against them unjustly, and all the while the little cough continued, and the blood-spitting returned at the end of cruel intervals, when he had begun to hope that at least that trouble was done with. One morning he told his wife that he was going to ask the doctors to examine him again. They had spoken of patching him up, but he wanted to know whether he was going to live or die. There was a certain relief in hearing him speak so plainly. She had had enough of the torture of hope, and would like to know the worst. He liked better to go to the hospital alone, but she felt that she could not sit at home counting the minutes for him to return, and begged to be allowed to go with him. To her surprise he offered no opposition. She had expected that her request would bring about quite a little scene, but he had taken it so much as a matter of course that she should accompany him that she was doubly glad that she had proposed to go with him. If she hadn't, he might have accused her of neglecting him. She put on her hat. The day was too hot for a jacket. It was the beginning of August. The town was deserted, and the streets looked as if they were about to evaporate or lie down exhausted, and the poor, dry, dusty air that remained after the season was too poor even for Esther's healthy lungs. It made William cough, and she hoped the doctors would order him to the seaside. From the top of their omnibus they could see right across the plateau of the Green Park, dry and colourless like a desert. As they descended the hill they noticed that autumn was already busying in the foliage. Lower down the dells were full of fallen leaves. At Hyde Park Corner the blown dust whirled about the hilltop. All along St. George's Place glimpses of the empty park appeared through the railings. The wide pavements, the Brompton Road, and a semi-detached public house at the crossroads announced suburban London to the Londoner.
"You see," said William, "where them trees are, where the road turns off to the left, that house is the Bell and Horns. That's the sort of house I should like to see you in."
"It's a pity we didn't buy it when we had the money."
"Buy it? That house is worth £10,000 if it is worth a penny."
"I was once in a situation not far from here. I like the Fulham Road. It's like a long village street, ain't it?" Her first service was with Mrs. Dunbar in Sydney Street, and she remembered the square church tower at the Chelsea end. A little further on there was the vestry hall in the King's Road, and then Oakley Street on the left, leading down to Battersea. Mrs. Dunbar used to go to some gardens at the end of the King's Road. Cremorne Gardens, that was the name. There used to be fireworks there, and she often spent the evening at the back window watching the rockets go up. That was just before Lady Elwyn had got her the situation as kitchen maid at Woodview. She remembered the very shops. There was Palmer's, the butterman, and there was Hyde's, the grocer's. Everything was just as she had left it. How many years ago? 15 or 16? So enwrapped was she in memories that William had to touch her.
"Here we are," he said. "Don't you remember the place?"
She remembered very well that great red brick building. a centrepiece with two wings surrounded by high iron railings lined with gloomy shrubs. The long straight walks, the dismal trees arow, where pale-faced men walked or rested feebly, had impressed themselves on her young mind, thin, patient men, pacing their sepulchre. She had wondered who they were, if they would get well, and then, quick with sensation of lingering death, she had hurried away on her errands. The low, wooden, yellow-painted gates were unchanged. She had never before seen them open, and it was new to her to see the gardens filled with bright sunshine and numerous visitors. There were flowers in the beds, and the trees were beautiful in their leafage. A little yellow was creeping through, and from time to time a leaf fell exhausted from the branches. William, who was already familiar with the custom of the place, nodded to the porter, and was let pass without question. He did not turn to the principal entrance in the middle of the building, but went towards a side entrance. The house physician was standing near it, talking with a young man whom Esther recognized as Mr. Alden. The thought that he too might be dying of consumption crossed her mind, but his appearance and his healthy, hearty laugh reassured her. A stout common girl, healthy too, came out of the building with a child, a little thing of 12 or 13, with death in her face. Mr. Alden stopped her, and in his cheerful, kind manner hoped the little one was better. She answered that she was. The doctor bade him good-bye, and beckoned William and Esther to follow him. Esther would have liked to have spoken to Mr. Alden, but he did not see her, and she followed her husband, who was talking with the doctor, through the doorway into a long passage. At the end of the passage there were a number of girls in print dresses. The gaiety of the dresses led Esther to think that they must be visitors, but the little calf warned her that death was amongst them. As she went past she caught sight of a wasted form in a bath chair. The thin hands were laid on the knees on a little handkerchief, and there were spots on the whiteness deeper than the colour of the dress. They passed down another passage, meeting a sister on their way. Pretty and discreet she was in her black dress and veil, and she raised her eyes, glancing affectionately at the young doctor. No doubt they loved each other. The eternal love story among so much death. Esther wished to be present at the examination, but a sudden whim made William say that he would prefer to be alone with the doctor, and she returned to the garden. Mr. Alden had not yet gone. He stood with his back turned to her. The little girl she had seen him speaking to was sitting on a bench under the trees. She held in her hands a skein of yellow worsted, which her companion was winding into a ball. 2 other young women were with them, and all 4 were smiling and whispering and looking towards Mr. Alden. They evidently sought to attract his attention, and wished him to come and speak to them. Just the natural desire of women to please, and moved by the pathos of this poor coquetting, he went to them, and Esther could see that they all wanted to talk to him. She would have liked to have spoken to him. He was an old friend, and she walked up the grounds, intending to pass by him as she walked back. His back was still turned to her, and they were all so interested that they gave no heed to anything else. One of the young women had an exceedingly pretty face, a small oval, perfectly snow white, and large blue eyes, shaded with long dark lashes, a little aquiline nose, and Esther heard her say, "I should be well enough if it wasn't for the calf. It isn't no better since—" The calf interrupted the end of the sentence, and, affecting to misunderstand her, Mr. Alden said, "No better than it was a week ago?" "A week ago?" said the poor girl. "It's no better since Christmas." There was surprise in her voice, and the pity of it took Mr. Alden in the throat, and it was with difficulty that he answered that he hoped that the present fine weather would enable her to get well. "Such weather as this," he said, "is as good as going abroad." This assertion was disputed. One of the women had been to Australia for her health, and the story of travel was interspersed with the little coughs, terrible in their apparent insignificance. But it was Mr. Alden that the others wished to hear speak. They knew all about their companion's trip to Australia, and in their impatience their eyes went towards Esther. So Mr. Alden became aware of a new presence, and he turned. "What, is it you, Esther?" "Yes, sir." "But there doesn't seem much the matter with you. You're all right?" "Yes, I'm all right, sir. It's my husband." They walked a few yards up the path. "Your husband? I'm very sorry." "He's been an outdoor patient for some time. He's being examined by the doctors now." "Whom did you marry, Esther?" "William Latch, a betting man, sir." "You married a betting man, Esther? How curiously things do work out. I remember you were engaged to a pious young man, the stationer's foreman. That was when you were with Miss Rice. You know, I suppose, that she's dead." "No, sir, I didn't know it. I've had so much trouble lately that I've not been to see her for nearly 2 years. When did she die, sir?" "About 2 months ago." "So you married a betting man. Miss Rice did say something about it, but I don't think I understood that he was a betting man. I thought he was a publican." "So he was, sir. We lost our licence through the betting." "You say he's being examined by the doctor. Is it a bad case?" "I'm afraid it is, sir." They walked on in silence until they reached the gate. "To me this place is infinitely pathetic. That little calf never silent for long. Did you hear that poor girl say with surprise that her calf is no better than it was last Christmas?" "Yes, sir, poor girl. I don't think she's long for this world." "But tell me about your husband, Esther," he said, and his face filled with an expression of true sympathy. "I'm a subscriber, and if your husband would like to become an indoor patient, I hope you'll let me know." "Thank you, sir. You was always the kindest. But there's no reason why I should trouble you. Some friends of ours have already recommended him, and it only rests with himself to remain out or go in." He pulled out his watch and said, "I'm sorry to have met you in such sad circumstances, but I'm glad to have seen you. It must be 7 years or more since you left Miss Rice. You haven't changed much. You keep your good looks." "Oh, sir!" He laughed at her embarrassment and walked across the road, hailing a hansom, just as he used to in old times when he came to see Miss Rice. The memory of those days came back upon her. It was strange to meet him again after so many years. She felt she had seen him now for the last time. But it was foolish and wicked, too, to think of such things, her husband dying. But she couldn't help it. He reminded her so much of what was past and gone. A moment after she dashed these personal tears aside and walked open-hearted to meet William. What had the doctor said? She must know the truth. If she was to lose him, she would lose everything. No, not everything. Her boy would still remain to her. And she felt that, after all, her boy was what was most real to her in life. These thoughts had passed through her mind before William had had time to answer her question.
"He said the left lung was gone, that I'd never be able to stand another winter in England. He said I must go to Egypt."
"Egypt," she repeated.
Is that very far from here?" "What matter how far it is? If I can't live in England, I must go where I can live." "Don't be cross, dear. I know it's your health that makes you that irritable, but it is hard to bear at times." "You won't care to go to Egypt with me." "How can you think that, Bill? Have I ever refused you anything?" "Quite right, old girl. I'm sorry. I know you'd do anything for me. I've always said so, haven't I? It is this cough that makes me sharp-tempered and fretful. I shall be different when I get to Egypt." "When do we start?" "If we get away by the end of October, it will be all right. It will cost a lot of money, the journey is expensive, and we shall have to stop there 6 months. I couldn't think of coming home before the end of April."
Esther did not answer. They walked some yards in silence. Then he said,
"I've been very unlucky lately. There isn't much over £100 in the bank."
"How much shall we want?"
"£300 or £400 at least. We won't take the boy with us. We couldn't afford that, but I should like to pay a couple of quarters in advance."
"That won't be much."
"Not if I have any luck. The luck must turn, and I have some splendid information about the Great Ebor and the Yorkshire Stakes. Stack knows of a horse or two that's being kept for Sandown. Unfortunately, there is not much doing in August. I must try to make up the money. It's a matter of life and death."
It was for his very life that her husband was now gambling on the race course, and a sensation of very great wickedness came up in her mind, but she stifled it instantly. William had noticed the look of fear that appeared in her eyes, and he said,
"It's my last chance. I can't get the money any other way, and I don't want to die yet awhile. I haven't been as good to you as I'd like, and I want to do something for the boy, you know."
He had been told not to remain out after sundown, but he was resolved to leave no stone unturned in his search for information, and often he returned home as late as 9 and 10 o'clock at night, coughing. Esther could hear him all up the street. He came in ready to drop with fatigue, his pockets filled with sporting papers, and these he studied, spreading them on the table under the lamp, while Esther sat striving to do some needlework. It often dropped out of her hands, and her eyes filled with tears, but she took care that he should not see these tears. She did not wish to distress him unnecessarily. Poor chap, he had had enough to put up with as it was. Sometimes he read out the horses' names, and asked her which she thought would win, which seemed to her a likely name, but she begged of him not to ask her. They had had many quarrels on this subject, but in the end he understood that it was not fair to ask her. Sometimes Stack and Journeyman came in, and they argued about weights and distances until midnight. Old John came to see them, and every day he had heard some new tip. It often rose to Esther's lips to tell William to back his fancy and have done with it. She could see that these discussions only fatigued him, that he was no nearer to the truth now than he was a fortnight ago. Meanwhile the horse he had thought of backing had gone up in the betting, but he said that he must be very careful. They had only £100 left. He must be careful not to risk this money foolishly. It was his very life blood. If he were to lose all his money, he wouldn't only sign his own death warrant, but also hers. He might linger on a long while, there was no knowing, but he would never be able to do any work, that was certain, unless he went out to Egypt. The doctor had said so, and then it would be she who would have to support him. and if God were merciful enough to take him off at once, he would leave her in a worse plight than he had found her in. And the boy growing up, oh, it was terrible. He buried his face in his hands and seemed quite overcome. Then the calf would take him, and for a few minutes he could only think of himself. Esther gave him a little milk to drink, and he said, "There's £100 left, Esther. It isn't much, but it's something. I don't believe that there's much use in my going to Egypt. I shall never get well. It is better that I should pitch myself into the river. That would be the least selfish way out of it."
"William, I will not have you talk in that way,"
Esther said, laying down her work and going over to him.
"If you was to do such a thing, I should never forgive you. I could never think the same of you."
"All right, old girl, don't be frightened. I've been thinking too much about them horses, and I'm a bit depressed. I dare say it will come out all right. I think that Mahomet is sure to win the Great Eber, don't you?"
"I don't think there's no better judge than yourself. They all say if he don't fall lame that he is bound to win."
"Then Mahomet shall carry my money. I'll back him tomorrow."
Now that he had made up his mind what horse to back, his spirits revived. He was able to dismiss the subject from his mind, and they talked of other things, of their son, and they laid projects for his welfare. But on the day of the race, from early morning, William could barely contain himself. Usually he took his winnings and losings very quietly. When he had been especially unlucky, he swore a bit, but Esther had never seen any great excitement before a race was run. The issue of this race were extraordinary, and it was heartbreaking to see him suffer. He could not remain still a moment. A prey to all the terrors of hope, exhausted with anticipation, he rested himself against the sideboard and wiped drops of sweat from his forehead. A broiling sunlight infested their window panes. The room grew oven-like, and he was obliged at last to go into the back parlour and lie down. He lay there in his shirt sleeves, quite exhausted, hardly able to breathe. The arm, once so strong and healthy, was shrunken to a little nothing. He seemed quite bloodless, and looking at him Esther could hardly hope that any climate would restore him to health. He just asked her what the time was, and said,
"The race is being run now."
A few minutes after he said,
"I think Mahomet has won. I fancied I saw him get first past the post."
He spoke as if he were sure, and said nothing about the evening paper. If he were disappointed, Esther felt that it would kill him, and she knelt down by the bedside and prayed that God would allow the horse to win. It meant her husband's life, that was all she knew. Oh, that the horse might win! Presently he said,
"There is no use praying. I feel sure it is all right. Go into the next room. Stand on the balcony so that you may see the boy coming along."
A pale yellow sky rose behind the brick neighbourhood, and with agonized soul the woman viewed its plausive serenity. There seemed to be hope in its quietness. At that moment the cry came up,
"Winner! Winner!"
It came from the north, from the east, and now from the west. 3 boys were shouting forth the news simultaneously. Ah, if it should prove bad news! But somehow she too felt that the news was good. She ran to meet the boy. She had a halfpenny ready in her hand. He fumbled, striving to detach a single paper from the quire under his arm.
Seeing her impatient, he said,
"Mahomet's won."
Then the pavement seemed to slide beneath her feet, and the setting sun she could hardly see. So full was her heart, so burdened with the happiness that she was bringing to the poor sick fellow who lay in his shirt sleeves on the bed in the back room. "It is all right," she said. "I thought so too. It seemed like it." His face flushed. Life seemed to come back. He sat up and took the paper from her. "There," he said, "I've got my place money too. I hope Stack and Journeyman come in tonight. I'd like to have a chat about this. Come, give me a kiss, dear. I'm not going to die after all. It isn't a pleasant thing to think that you must die, that there's no hope for you, that you must go underground." The next thing to do was to pick the winner of the Yorkshire Handicap. In this he was not successful, but he backed several winners at Sandown Park, and at the close of the week had made nearly enough to take him to Egypt. The Doncaster week, however, proved disastrous. He lost most of his winnings and had to look forward to retrieving his fortunes at Newmarket.
"The worst of it is, if I don't make up the money by October, it will be no use. They say the November fogs will polish me off."
Between Doncaster and Newmarket he lost a bet, and this bet carried him back into despondency. He felt it was no use struggling against fate. Better remain in London and be taken away at the end of November or December. He couldn't last much longer than that. This would allow him to leave Esther at least £50 to go on with. The boy would soon be able to earn money. It would be better so. No use wasting all this money for the sake of his health, which wasn't worth twopence 3 farthings. It was like throwing sovereigns after farthings. He didn't want to do any betting. He was as hollow as a shell inside. He could feel it. Egypt could do nothing for him. And as he had to go, better sooner than later. Esther argued with him. What should she have to live for if he was taken from her? The doctors had said that Egypt might set him right. She didn't know much about such things, but she had always heard that it was extraordinary how people got cured out there.
"That's true," he said. "I've heard that people who couldn't live a week in England, or haven't the length of your finger of lung left, can go on all right out there. I might get something to do out there, and the boy might come out after us."
"That's the way I like to hear you talk. Who knows, at Newmarket we might have luck. Just one big bet, a winner at 50 to 1. That's all we want."
"That's just what has been passing in me mind. I've got particular information about the Cesarewitch and Cambridgeshire. I could get the prize you speak of, 50 to 1 against the two, Matchbox and Chasuble, the double event. You know, I'm inclined to go it. It's my last chance."
End of chapter 42. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 43 of Esther Waters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Esther Waters by George Moore. Chapter 43. When Matchbox galloped home the winner of the Cesarewitch by 5 lengths, William was lying in his bed, seemingly at death's door. He had remained out late one evening, had caught cold, and his mouth was constantly filled with blood. He was much worse, and could hardly take notice of the good news. When he revived a little, he said,
"It has come too late."
But when Chasuble was back to win thousands at 10 to 1, and Journeyman and Stack assured him that the stable was quite confident of being able to pull it off, his spirits revived. He spoke of hedging.
"If,"
he said to Esther,
"I was to get out at 8 or 9 to 1, I should be able to leave you something, you know, in case of accidents."
But he would not entrust laying off his bet to either Stack or Journeyman. He spoke of a cab and seeing to it himself. If he did this, the doctor assured him that it would not much matter whether Chasuble won or lost. The best thing he could do, the doctor said, would be to become an indoor patient at once. In the hospital he would be an equable temperature, and he would receive an attention which he could not get at home. William did not like going into the hospital. It would be a bad omen. If he did, he felt sure that Chasuble would not win. "What has going or not going to the hospital to do with Chasuble's chance of winning the Cambridgeshire?" said the doctor. "This window is loose in its sash, a draught comes under the door, and if you close out the draught the atmosphere of the room becomes stuffy. You're thinking of going abroad. A fortnight's nice rest is just what you want to set you up for your journey." So he allowed himself to be persuaded. He was taken to the hospital, and Esther remained at home waiting for the fateful afternoon. Now that the dying man was taken from her, she had no work to distract her thoughts. The unanswerable question, would Chasuble win, was always before her. She saw the slender greyhound creatures as she had seen them at Epsom, through a sea of heads and hats, and she asked herself if Chasuble was the brown horse that had galloped in first, or the chestnut that had trotted in last. She often thought she was going mad. Her head seemed like it, a sensation of splitting like a piece of calico. She went to see her boy. Jack was a great tall fellow of 15, and had happily lost none of his affection for his mother, and great sweetness rose up within her. She looked at his long, straight, yellow-stockinged legs. She settled the collar of his cloak, and slipped her fingers into his leathern belt as they walked side by side. He was bareheaded according to the fashion of his school, and she kissed the wild dark curls with which his head was run over. They were much brighter in colour when he was a little boy, those days when she slaved 17 hours a day for his dear life, but he paid her back tenfold for the hardship she had undergone. She listened to the excellent report his masters gave of his progress, and walked through the quadrangles and the corridors with him, thinking of the sound of his voice as he told her the story of his classes and his studies. She must live for him, though for herself she had had enough of life. But, thank God, she had her darling boy, and whatever unhappiness there might be in store for her, she would bear it for his sake. He knew that his father was ill, but she refrained and told him no word of the tragedy that was hanging over them. The noble instincts which were so intrinsically Esther Waters told her that it were a pity to soil at the outset a young life with a sordid story. And though it would have been an inexpressible relief to her to have shared her trouble with her boy, she forced back her tears and courageously bore her cross alone, without once allowing its edge to touch him. And every day that visitors were allowed she went to the hospital with a newspaper containing the last betting.
"Chasuble 10 to 1 taken," William read out.
The mare had advanced 3 points, and William looked at Esther inquiringly and with hope in his eyes.
"I think she'll win,"
he said, raising himself in his cane chair. "I hope so, dear," she murmured, and she settled his cushions. 2 days after the mare was back again at 13 to 1 taken and offered. She went back even as far as 18 to 1, and then returned for a while to 12 to 1. This fluctuation meant that something was wrong, and William began to lose hope. But on the following day the mare was back to win a good deal of money at Tattersall's, and once more she stood at 10 to 1. Seeing her back at the old price made William look so hopeful that a patient stopped as he passed down the corridor, and catching the sight of the sportsman on William's lap, he asked him if he was interested in racing. William told him that he was, and that if Chasuble won he would be able to go to Egypt.
Them that has money can buy health as well as everything else. We'd all get well if we could get out there.
Then William told him how much he stood to win.
That'll keep you going long enough to set you straight. You say the mare's backed at 10 to 1, 200 to 20. I wonder if I could get the money. I might sell up the house.
But before he had time to realize the necessary money, the mare was driven back to 18 to 1, and he said,
"She won't win. I might as well leave the wife in the house. There's no luck for them that comes here."
On the day of the race Esther walked through the streets like one daft, stupidly interested in the passers-by and the disputes that arose between the drivers of cabs and omnibuses. Now and then her thoughts collected, and it seemed to her impossible that the mare should win. If she did, they would have £2,500 and would go to Egypt. But she could not imagine such a thing. It seemed so much more natural that the horse should lose, and that her husband should die, and that she should have to face the world once more. She offered up prayers that Chasuble might win, although it did not seem right to address God on the subject, but her heart often felt like breaking, and she had to do something. And she had no doubt that God would forgive her. But now that the day had come, she did not feel as if he had granted her request. At the same time it did not seem possible that her husband was going to die. It was all so hard to understand. She stopped at the Bell and Horns to see what the time was, and was surprised to find it was half an hour later than she had expected. The race was being run. Chasuble's hoofs were deciding whether her husband was to live or die. It was on the wire by this time. The wires were distinct upon a blue and dove-coloured sky. Did that one go to Newmarket, or the other? Which? The red buildings came in sight, and a patient walked slowly up the walk. His back turned to her. Another had sat down to rest. 16 years ago patients were walking there then, and the leaves were scattering then just as now. Without transition of thoughts she wondered when the first boy would appear with the news. Williams was not in the grounds. He was upstairs behind those windows. Poor fellow! She could fancy him sitting there. Perhaps he was watching for her out of one of those windows. But there was no use her going up until she had the news. She must wait for the paper. She walked up and down listening for the cry. Every now and then expectation led her to mistake some ordinary cry for the terrible "Winner, all the winner," with which the whole town would echo in a few minutes. She hastened forward. No, it was not it. At last she heard the word shrieked behind her. She hastened after the boy, but failed to overtake him. Returning, she met another, gave him a halfpenny and took a paper. Then she remembered she must ask the boy to tell her who won. But heedless of her question, He had run across the road to sell papers to some men who had come out of a public house. She must not give William the paper and wait for him to read the news to her. If the news were bad, the shock might kill him. She must learn first what the news was, so that her face and manner might prepare him for the worst if need be. So she offered the paper to the porter and asked him to tell her.
"Bramble, King of Trumps, young hopeful," he read out.
"Are you sure that Chasuble hasn't won?"
"Of course I'm sure. There it is."
"I can't read," she said as she turned away. The news had stunned her. The world seemed to lose reality. She was uncertain what to do, and several times repeated to herself, "There's nothing for it but to go up and tell him. I don't see what else I can do." The staircase was very steep. She climbed it slowly and stopped at the first landing and looked out of the window. A poor hollow-chested creature, the wreck of a human being, struggled up behind her. He had to rest several times, and in the hollow buildings his cough sounded loud and hollow. "It isn't generally so loud as that," she thought, and wondered how she could tell William the news. "He wanted to see Jack grow up to be a man. He thought that we might all go to Egypt, and that he'd get quite well there, for there's plenty of sunshine there. But now he'll have to make up his mind to die in the November fogs." Her thoughts came strangely clear, and she was astonished at her indifference, until a sudden revulsion of feeling took her as she was going up the last flight. She couldn't tell him the news. It was too cruel. She let the patient pass her, and when alone on the landing she looked down into the depth. She thought she'd like to fall over, anything rather than to do what she knew she must do. But her cowardice only endured for a moment, and with a firm step she walked into the corridor. It seemed to cross the entire building, and was floored and wainscoted with the same brown varnished wood as the staircase. There were benches along the walls, and emaciated and worn-out men lay on the long cane chairs in the windowed recesses by which the passage was lighted. The wards, containing sometimes 3, sometimes 6 or 7 beds, opened on to this passage. The doors of the wards were all open, and as she passed along she started at the sight of a boy sitting up in a bed. His head had been shaved, and only a slight bristle covered the crown. The head and face were a large white mass with 2 eyes. At the end of the passage there was a window, and William sat there reading a book. He saw her before she saw him, and when she caught sight of him she stopped, holding the paper loose before her between finger and thumb, and as she approached she saw that her manner had already broken the news to him.
"I see she didn't win," he said.
"No, dear, she didn't win. We wasn't lucky this time. Next time."
"There is no next time, at least for me. I shall be far away from here when flat racing begins again. The November fogs will do for me. I feel that they will. I hope there'll be no lingering, that's all. Better to know the worst and make up your mind. So I have to go, have I? So there's no hope, and I shall be underground before the next meeting. I shall never lay or take the odds again. It do seem strange. If only that mare had won. I knew damned well she wouldn't if I came here."
Then, catching sight of the pained look on his wife's face, he said,
"I don't suppose it made no difference. It was to be, and what has to be has to be. I've got to go underground. I felt it was to be all along. Egypt would have done me no good. I never believed in it, only a lot of false hope. You don't think what I say is true? Look here, do you know what book this is? This is the Bible. That'll prove to you that I knew the game was up. I knew, I can't tell you how, but I knew the mare wouldn't win. One always seems to know. Even when I backed her, I didn't feel about her like I did about the other one. And ever since I've been feeling more and more sure that it wasn't to be. Somehow it didn't seem likely, and today something told me that the game was up. So I asked for this book. There's wonderful, beautiful things in it.
There is indeed, Bill, and I hope you won't get tired of it, but will go on reading it.
It's extraordinary how consoling it is. Listen to this. Isn't it beautiful? Ain't them words heavenly?
They is indeed. I knew you'd come to God at last.
I'm afraid I've not led a good life. I wouldn't listen to you when you used to tell me of the lot of harm the betting used to bring on the poor people what used to come to our place. There's Sarah. I suppose she's out of prison by this. You've seen nothing of her, I suppose?
No, nothing.
There was Ketley.
No, Bill, don't let's think about it. If you're truly sorry, God will forgive.
Do you think he will? And the others that we know nothing about? I wouldn't listen to you. I was headstrong, but I understand it all now. My eyes have been opened. Them pious folk that got up the prosecution knew what they was about. I forgive them one and all.
William coughed a little. The conversation paused, and the cough was repeated down the corridor. Now it came from the men lying on the long cane chairs, now from the poor emaciated creature, hollow cheeks, brown eyes, and beard, who had just come out of his ward and had sat down on a bench by the wall. Now it came from an old man 6 feet high, with snow-white hair. He sat near them and worked assiduously at a piece of tapestry. "It'll be better when it's cut," he said to one of the nurses, who had stopped to compliment him of his work. "It'll be better when it's cut." Then the cough came from one of the wards, and Esther thought of the fearsome boy sitting bolt up, his huge tallow-like face staring through the silence of the room. A moment after the cough came from her husband's lips, and they looked at each other. Both wanted to speak, and neither knew what to say. At last William spoke.
"I was saying that I never had that feeling about Chasuble as one has about a winner. Did she run second? Just like my luck if she did. Let me see the paper."
Esther handed it to him.
"Bramble, a 50-to-1 chance. Not a man in 100 backed her. King of trumps. There was some place money lost on him. Young hopeful, a rank outsider. What a day for the bookies."
"You mustn't think of them things no more," said Esther. "You've got the book. It'll do you more good."
"If I'd only have thought of Bramble. I could have had 100-to-1 against matchbooks and Bramble coupled."
"What's the use of thinking of things that's over? We should think of the future."
"If I'd only been able to hedge that bet, I should have been able to leave you something to go on with. But now, when everything is paid for, you'll have hardly a £5 note. You've been a good wife to me, and I've been a bad husband to you."
"Bill, you mustn't speak like that. You must try to make your peace with God. Think of Him. He'll think of us that you leave behind. I've always had faith in him. He'll not desert me." Her eyes were quite dry. The instinct of life seemed to have left her. They spoke some little while longer, until it was time for visitors to leave the hospital. It was not until she got into the Fulham Road that tears began to run down her cheeks. They poured faster and faster, like rain after a long dry weather. The whole world disappeared in a mist of tears, and so overcome was she by her grief that she had to lean against the railings, and then the passers-by turned and looked at her curiously. End of chapter 43. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 44 of Esther Waters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Esther Waters by George Moore. Chapter 44. With fair weather he might hold on till Christmas, but if much fog was about he would go off with the last leaves. One day Esther received a letter asking her to defer her visit from Friday to Sunday. He hoped to be better on Sunday, and then they would arrange when she should come to take him away. He begged of her to have Jack home to meet him. He wanted to see his boy before he died. Mrs. Collins, a woman who lived in the next room, read the letter to Esther.
"If you can, do as he wishes. Once they get them fancies into their heads, there's no getting them out."
"If he leaves the hospital on a day like this, it'll be the death of him." Both women went to the window. The fog was so thick that only an outline here and there was visible of the house opposite. The lamps burnt low, mournful, as in a city of the dead, and the sounds that rose out of the street added to the terror of the strange darkness. "What do we say about Jack? That I'm to send for him? It's natural he should like to see the boy before he goes, but it would be cheerfuller to take him to the hospital."
"You see, he wants to die at home. He wants you to be with him at the last."
"Yes, I want to see the last of him. But the boy, where is he to sleep?"
"We can lay a mattress down in my room. An old woman like me, it don't matter."
Sunday morning was harsh and cold, and when she came out of South Kensington Station a fog was rising in the squares, and a great whiff of yellow cloud drifted down upon the housetops. In the Fulham Road the tops of the houses disappeared, and the light of the third gas lamp was not visible. "This is the sort of weather that takes them off. I can hardly breathe it myself." Everything was shadow-like. Those walking in front of her passed out of sight like shades, and once she thought she must have missed her way, though that was impossible, for her way was quite straight. Suddenly the silhouette of the winged building rose up enormous on the sulphur sky. The low-lying gardens were full of poisonous vapour, and the thin trees seemed like the ghosts of consumptive men. The porter coughed like a dead man as she passed, and he said,
"Bad weather for the poor sick ones upstairs."
She was prepared for a change for the worse, but she did not expect to see a living man looking so like a dead one. He could no longer lie back in bed and breathe, so he was propped up with pillows, and he looked even as shadow-like as those she had half seen in the fog cloud. There was fog even in the ward, and the lights burned red in the silence. There were 5 beds, low iron bedsteads, and each was covered with a dark red rug. In the furthest corner lay the wreck of a great working man. He wore his hobnails and his corduroys, and his once brawny arm lay along his thigh, shrivelled and powerless as a child's. In the middle of the room a little clerk, wasted and weary, without any strength at all, lay striving for breath. The navvy was alone. The little clerk had his family round him, his wife and his 2 children, a baby in arms and a little boy 3 years old. The doctor had just come in, and the woman was prattling gaily about her confinement. She said, "I was up the following week. Wonderful what we women can go through. No one would think it. Brought the childer to see their father. They is a little idol to him, poor fellow." "How are you today, dearie?" Esther said as she took a seat by her husband's bed.
Better than I was on Friday, but this weather'll do for me if it continues much longer. You see them 2 beds? They died yesterday, and I've heard that 3 or 4 that left the hospital are gone too."
The doctor came to William's bed.
"Well, are you still determined to go home?" he said.
"Yes, I'd like to die at home. You can't do nothing for me. I'd like to die at home. I want to see my boy."
"You can see Jack here," said Esther.
"I'd sooner see him at home. I suppose you don't want the trouble of a death in the house."
"Oh, William, how can you speak so?" The patient coughed painfully and leaned against the pillows, unable to speak. Esther remained with William till the time permitted to visitors had expired. He could not speak to her, but she knew he liked her to be with him. When she came on Thursday to take him away, he was a little better. The clerk's wife was chattering. The great navvy lay in the corner still as a block of stone. Esther often looked at him and wondered if he had no friend who could spare an hour to come and see him.
"I was beginning to think that you wasn't coming," said William.
"He's that restless," said the clerk's wife, "asking the time every 3 or 4 minutes." "How could you think that?" said Esther.
"I dunno. You're a bit late, aren't you?"
"It often do make them that restless," said the clerk's wife. "But me poor old man is quiet enough, aren't you, dear?" The dying clerk could not answer, and the woman turned again to Esther. "And how do you find him today?" "Much the same. I think he's a bit better, stronger, don't you know? But this weather is that trying. I don't know how it was up your way, but down my way I never seen such a fog. I thought I'd have to turn back." At that moment the baby began to cry, and the woman walked up and down the ward, rocking it violently, talking loud and making a great deal of noise, but she could not quiet him. "Hungry again," she said. "I never seen such a child for the breast," and she sat down and unbuttoned her dress. When the young doctor entered she hurriedly covered herself. He begged her to continue, and spoke about her little boy. She showed him a scar on his throat. He had been suffering, but it was all right now. The doctor glanced at the breathless father. "A little better today, thank you, doctor."
"That's all right," and the doctor went over to William. "Are you still determined to leave the hospital?" he said.
"Yes, I want to go home. I want to—"
"You'll find this weather very trying. You'd better—"
"No, thank you, sir. I should like to go home. You've been very kind. You've done everything that could be done for me. But it's God's will. My wife is very grateful to you too."
"Yes, indeed I am, sir. However am I to thank you for your kindness to my husband?"
"I'm sorry I couldn't do more. But you'll want the sister to help you to dress him. I'll send her to you."
When they got him out of bed, Esther was shocked at the spectacle of his poor body. There was nothing left of him. His poor chest, his wasted ribs, his legs gone to nothing, and the strange weakness, worst of all, which made it so hard for them to dress him. At last it was nearly done. Esther laced one boot, the nurse the other, and leaning on Esther's arm he looked round the room for the last time. The navvy turned round on his bed and said, "Goodbye, mate." "Goodbye. Goodbye, all." The clerk's little son clung to his mother's skirt, frightened at the weakness of so big a man. "Go and say goodbye to the gentleman." The little boy came forward timidly, offering his hand. William looked at the poor little white face. He nodded to the father and went out. As he went downstairs he said he would like to go home in a hansom. The doctor and nurse expostulated, but he persisted until Esther begged of him to forego the wish for her sake. "They do rattle so, these four-wheelers, especially when the windows are up. One can't speak." The cab jogged up Piccadilly, and as it climbed out of the hollow, the dying man's eyes were fixed on the circle of lights that shone across the Green Park. They looked like a distant village, and Esther wondered if William was thinking of Shoreham. She had seen Shoreham look like that sometimes. Or if he was thinking that he was looking on London for the last time. Was he saying to himself, "I shall never see Piccadilly again"? They passed St. James's Street. The circus, with its mob of prostitutes, came into view. The Criterion Bar, with its loafers standing outside. William leaned a little forward, and Esther was sure he was thinking that he would never go into that bar again. The cab turned to the left, and Esther said that it would cross Soho, perhaps pass down Old Compton Street, opposite their old house. It happened that it did, and Esther and William wondered who were the new people who were selling beer and whisky in the bar. All the while boys were crying, "Winner, all the winner." They was run today, flat racing all over for this year. Esther did not answer. The cab passed over a piece of asphalt, and he said, "Is Jack waiting for us?" "Yes, he came home yesterday." The fog was thick in Bloomsbury, and when he got out of the cab he was taken with a fit of coughing, and had to cling to the railings. She had to pay the cab, and it took some time to find the money. Would no one open the door? She was surprised to see him make his way up the steps to the bell, and having got her change, she followed him into the house. "I can manage. Go on first, I'll follow." And stopping every 3 or 4 steps for rest, he slowly dragged himself up to the first landing. A door opened, and Jack stood on the threshold of the lighted room. "Is that you, mother?" "Yes, dear. Your father is coming up." The boy came forward to help, but his mother whispered, "He'd rather come up by himself." William had just strength to walk into the room. They gave him a chair, and he fell back exhausted. He looked around and seemed pleased to see his home again. Esther gave him some milk, into which she had put a little brandy, and he gradually revived. "Come this way, Jack. I want to look at you. Come into the light where I can see you." "Yes, father." "I haven't long to see you, Jack. I wanted to be with you and your mother in our own home. I can talk a little now. I may not be able to tomorrow." "Yes, father." "I want you to promise me, Jack, that you'll never have nothing to do with racing and betting. It hasn't brought me or your mother any luck." "Very well, father." "You promise me, Jack. Give me your hand. You promise me that, Jack." "Yes, father, I promise." "I see it all clearly enough now. Your mother, Jack, is the best woman in the world. She loved you better than I did. She worked for you.
That is a sad story. I hope you'll never hear it."
Husband and wife looked at each other, and in that look the wife promised the husband that the son should never know the story of her desertion.
"She was always against the betting, Jack. She always knew it would bring us ill luck. I was once well off, but I lost everything. No good comes of money that one doesn't work for."
"I'm sure you worked enough for what you won," said Esther, "travelling day and night from racecourse to racecourse, standing on them racecourses in all weathers. It was the colds you caught standing on them racecourses that began the mischief."
"I worked hard enough, that's true, but it was not the right kind of work. I can't argue, Esther, but I know the truth now. What you always said was the truth. No good comes of money that hasn't been properly earned."
He sipped the brandy and milk and looked at Jack, who was crying bitterly.
"You mustn't cry like that, Jack. I want you to listen to me. I've still something on me mind. Your mother, Jack, is the best woman that ever lived. You're too young to understand how good. I didn't know how good for a long time, but I found it all out in time, as you will later, Jack, when you are a man. I'd hoped to see you grow up to be a man, Jack, and your mother and I thought that you'd have a nice bit of money, but the money I hoped to leave you is all gone. What I feel most is that I'm leaving you and your mother as badly off as she was when I married her."
He heaved a deep sigh, and Esther said, "What is the good of talking of these things, weakening yourself for nothing?"
"I must speak, Esther. I should die happy if I knew how you and the boy was going to live. You'll have to go out and work for him as you did before. It will be like beginning it all again."
The tears rolled down his cheeks. He buried his face in his hands and sobbed until the sobbing brought on a fit of coughing. Suddenly his mouth filled with blood. Jack went for the doctor, and all remedies were tried without avail. "There is one more remedy," the doctor said, "and if that fails you must prepare for the worst." But this last remedy proved successful, and the hemorrhage was stopped, and William was undressed and put to bed. The doctor said, "He mustn't get up tomorrow." "You lie in bed tomorrow and try to get up your strength. You've overdone yourself today." She had drawn his bed into the warmest corner, close by the fire, and had made up for herself a sort of bed by the window, where she might doze a bit, for she did not expect to get much sleep. She would have to be up and down many times to settle his pillows and give him milk or a little weak brandy and water. Night wore away, the morning grew into day, and about 12 o'clock he insisted on getting up. She tried to persuade him, but he said he could not stop in bed, and there was nothing for it but to ask Mrs. Collins to help her dress him. They placed him comfortably in a chair. The cough had entirely ceased, and he seemed better. And on Saturday night he slept better than he had done for a long while, and woke up on Sunday morning refreshed and apparently much stronger. He had a nice bit of boiled rabbit for his dinner. He didn't speak much. Esther fancied that he was still thinking of them. When the afternoon waned about 4 o'clock, he called Jack. He told him to sit in the light where he could see him, and he looked at his son with such wistful eyes. These farewells were very sad, and Esther had to turn aside to hide her tears.
"I should have liked to have seen you a man, Jack."
"Don't speak like that. I can't bear it," said the poor boy, bursting into tears.
Perhaps you won't die yet." "Yes, Jack, I'm wore out. I can feel," he said, pointing to his chest, "that there is nothing here to live upon. It is the punishment come upon me." "Punishment for what, father?" "I wasn't always good to your mother, Jack." "If to please me, William, you'll say no more." "The boy ought to know. It will be a lesson for him, and it weighs upon my heart." "I don't want my boy to hear anything bad about his father, and I forbid him to listen." The conversation paused, and soon after William said that his strength was going from him, and that he would like to go back to bed. Esther helped him off with his clothes, and together she and Jack lifted him into bed. He sat up looking at them with wistful, dying eyes. "It is hard to part from you," he said. "If Chasuble had won, we would have all gone to Egypt. I could have lived out there." "You must speak of them things no more. We all must obey God's will." Esther dropped on her knees. She drew Jack down beside her, and William asked Jack to read something from the Bible. Jack read where he first opened the book, and when he had finished William said that he liked to listen. Jack's voice sounded to him like heaven. About 8 o'clock William bade his son good night. "Good night, my boy. Perhaps we shan't see each other again. This may be my last night." "I won't leave you, father." "No, my boy. Go to your bed. I feel I'd like to be alone with mother." The voice sank almost to a whisper. "You'll remember what you promised me about racing. Be good to your mother. She's the best mother a son ever had." "I'll work for mother, father. I'll work for her." "You're too young, my son. But when you're older, I hope you'll work for her. She worked for you. Goodbye, my boy." The dying man sweated profusely, and Esther wiped his face from time to time. Mrs. Collins came in. She had a large tin candlestick in her hand, in which there was a fragment of candle end. He motioned to her to put it aside. She put it on the table out of the way of his eyes. "You'll help Esther to lay me out. I don't want anyone else. I don't like the other woman." "Esther and me will lay you out. Make your mind easy. None but we two shall touch you." Once more Esther wiped his forehead, and he signed to her how he wished the bedclothes to be arranged, for he could no longer speak. Mrs. Collins whispered to Esther that she did not think that the end could be far off, and compelled by a morbid sort of curiosity, she took a chair and sat down. Esther wiped away the little drops of sweat as they came upon his forehead. His chest and throat had to be wiped also, for they too were full of sweat. His eyes were fixed on the darkness, and he moved his hand restlessly, and Esther always understood what he wanted. She gave him a little brandy and water, and when he could not take it from the glass, she gave it to him with a spoon. The silence grew more solemn, and the clock on the mantelpiece, striking 10 sharp strokes, did not interrupt it. And then, as Esther turned from the bedside for the brandy, Mrs. Collins's candle spluttered and went out. A little thread of smoke evaporated, leaving only a morsel of blackened wick. The flame had disappeared for ever, gone as if it had never been, and Esther saw darkness where there had been a light. Then she heard Mrs. Collins say, "I think it's all over, dear." The profile on the pillow seemed very little. "Hold up his head, so that if there is any breath it may come on the glass." He said they'd do right enough. You see, dear, there's not a trace of breath on the glass.
I'd like to say a prayer. Will you say a prayer with me?
Yes, I feel as if I should like to myself. It eases the heart wonderful.
End of chapter 44. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 45 of Esther Waters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Esther Waters by George Moore. Chapter 45. She stood on the platform watching the receding train. A few bushes hid the curve of the line. The white vapour rose above them, evaporating in the grey evening. A moment more and the last carriage would pass out of sight. The white gate swung slowly forward and closed over the line. An oblong box painted reddish brown lay on the seat beside her. A woman of 7 or 38, stout and strongly built, short arms and hard-worked hands, dressed in dingy black skirt and a threadbare jacket too thin for the dampness of a November day. Her face was a blunt outline, and the grey eyes reflected all the natural prose of the Saxon. The porter told her that he would try to send her box up to Woodview tomorrow. That was the way to Woodview, right up the lane. She could not miss it. She would find the lodge gate behind that clump of trees. And thinking how she could get her box to Woodview that evening, she looked at the barren strip of country lying between the downs and the shingle beach. The little town clamped about its deserted harbour seemed more than ever like falling to pieces like a derelict vessel. And when Esther passed over the level crossing, she noticed that the line of little villas had not increased. They were as she had left them 18 years ago. Laurels, iron railing, antimacassars. It was about 18 years ago, on a beautiful June day, that she had passed up this lane for the first time. At the very spot she was now passing she had stopped to wonder if she would be able to keep the place of kitchen maid. She remembered regretting that she had not a new dress. She had hoped to be able to brighten up the best of her cotton prints with a bit of red ribbon. The sun was shining, and she had met William leaning over the paling in the avenue smoking his pipe. 18 years had gone by. 18 years of labour, suffering, disappointment. A great deal had happened, so much that she could not remember it all. The situations she had been in, her life with that dear good soul Miss Rice, then Fred Parsons, then William again, her marriage, the life in the public house, money lost and money won, heartbreakings, death, everything that could happen had happened to her. Now it all seemed like a dream, but her boy remained to her. She had brought up her boy, thank God. She had been able to do that. But how had she done it? How often had she found herself within sight of the workhouse? The last time was no later than last week. Last week it had seemed to her that she would have to accept the workhouse. But she had escaped. And now here she was back at the very point from which she started, going back to Woodview, going back to Mrs. Barfield's service. William's illness and his funeral had taken Esther's last few pounds away from her, and when she and Jack came back from the cemetery, she found that she had broken into her last sovereign. She clasped him to her bosom. He was a tall boy of 15, and burst into tears. But she did not tell him what she was crying for. She did not say, "God only knows how we shall find bread to eat next week." She merely said, wiping away her tears, "We can't afford to live here any longer. It's too expensive for us now that father's gone." and they went to live in a slum for 3 and 6pence a week. If she had been alone in the world she would have gone into a situation, but she could not leave the boy, and so she had to look out for charing. It was hard to have to come down to this, particularly when she remembered that she had a house and a servant of her own. But there was nothing for it but to look out for some sharing, and get along as best she could until Jack was able to look after himself. But the various scrubbings and general cleaning that had come her way had been so badly paid that she soon found that she could not make both ends meet. She would have to leave her boy and go out as a general servant, and as her necessities were pressing, she accepted a situation in a coffee shop in the London Road. She would give all her wages to Jack, 7 shillings a week, and he would have to live on that. So long as she had her health she did not mind. It was a squat brick building with 4 windows that looked down on the pavement with a short-sighted stare. On each window was written in letters of white enamel, "Well-aired beds." A board nailed to a post by the side door announced that tea and coffee were always ready. On the other side of the sign was an upholsterer's, and the vulgar brightness of the Brussels carpets seemed in keeping with the slop-like appearance of the coffee house. Sometimes a workman came in the morning, a couple more might come in about dinner time. Sometimes they took rashers and bits of steak out of their pockets. "Won't you cook this for me, missus?" But it was not until about 9 in the evening that the real business of the house began, and it continued till 1, when the last straggler knocked for admittance. The house lived on its beds. The best rooms were sometimes let for 8 shillings a night, and there were 4 beds which were let at 4pence a night in the cellar, under the area where Esther stood by the great copper washing sheets, blankets, and counterpanes, when she was not cleaning the rooms upstairs. There was a double-bedded room underneath the kitchen, and over the landings, wherever a space could be found, the landlord, who was clever at carpentering work, had fitted up some sort of closet place that could be let as a bedroom. The house was a honeycomb. The landlord slept under the roof, and a corner had been found for his housekeeper, a handsome young woman at the end of the passage. Esther and the children, the landlord was a widower, slept in the coffee room upon planks laid across the tops of the high backs of the benches where the customers mealed. Mattresses and bedding were laid on these planks, and the sleepers lay, their faces hardly 2 feet from the ceiling. Esther slept with a baby, a little boy of 5. The 2 big boys slept at the other end of the room by the front door. The eldest was about 15, but he was only half-witted, and he helped in the housework, and could turn down the beds and see quicker than anyone if the occupant had stolen sheet or blanket. Esther always remembered how he would raise himself up in bed in the early morning, rub the glass, and light a candle, so that he could be seen from below. He shook his head if every bed was occupied, or signed with his fingers the prices of the beds if they had any to let. The landlord was a tall, thin man, with long features and hair turning grey. He was very quiet, and Esther was surprised one night at the abruptness with which he stopped a couple who were going upstairs. "Is that your wife?" he said. "Yes, she's my wife all right." "She don't look very old." "She's older than she looks." Then he said, half to Esther, half to his housekeeper, that it was hard to know what to do. If you asked them for their marriage certificates, they'd be sure to show you something. The housekeeper answered that they paid well, and that was the principal thing. But when an attempt was made to steal the bedclothes, the landlord and his housekeeper were more severe. As Esther was about to let a most respectable woman out of the front door, the idiot boy called down the stairs, "Stop her! There's a sheet missing." "Oh, what in the world is all this? I haven't got your sheet. Pray let me pass. I'm in a hurry." "I can't let you pass until the sheet is found." "You'll find it upstairs under the bed. It's got mislaid. I'm in a hurry." "Call in the police," shouted the idiot boy. "You'd better come upstairs and help me to find the sheet," said Esther. The woman hesitated a moment, and then walked up in front of Esther. When they were in the bedroom, she shook out her petticoats, and the sheet fell on the floor. "There now," said Esther, "a nice botheration you'd have got me into. I should have had to pay for it." "Oh, I could pay for it. It was only because I'm not very well off at present." "Yes, you will pay for it if you don't take care," said Esther. It was very soon after that Esther had her mother's books stolen from her. They had not been doing much business, and she had been put to sleep in one of the bedrooms. The room was suddenly wanted, and she had no time to move all her things, and when she went to make up the room, she found that her mother's books and a pair of jet earrings that Fred had given her had been stolen. She could do nothing. The couple who had occupied the rooms were far away by this time. There was no hope of ever recovering her books and earrings, and the loss of these things caused her a great deal of unhappiness. The only little treasure she possessed were those earrings. Now they were gone. She realized how utterly alone she was in the world. If her health were to break down tomorrow, she would have to go to the workhouse. What would become of her boy? She was afraid to think. Thinking did no good. She must not think, but must just work on, washing the bedclothes until she could wash no longer. Wash, wash all the week long, and it was only by working on till 1 o'clock in the morning that she sometimes managed to get the Sabbath free from washing. Never, not even in the house in Chelsea, had she had such hard work, and she was not as strong now as she was then. But her courage did not give way until one Sunday Jack came to tell her that the people who had employed him had sold their business. Then a strange weakness came over her. She thought of the endless week of work that awaited her in the cellar, the great copper on the fire, the heaps of soiled linen in the corner, the steam rising from the wash tub, and she felt she had not sufficient strength to get through another week of such work. She looked at her son with despair in her eyes. She had whispered to him as he lay asleep under her shawl, a tiny infant, "There is nothing for us, my poor boy, but the workhouse." And the same thought rose up in her mind as she looked at him, a tall lad with large grey eyes and dark curling hair. But she did not trouble him with her despair. She merely said, "I don't know how we shall pull through, Jack. God will help us." "You're washing too hard, mother. You're wasting away. Do you know no one, mother, who could help us?" She looked at Jack fixedly, and she thought of Mrs. Barfield. Mrs. Barfield might be away in the south with her daughter. If she were at Woodview, Esther felt sure she would not refuse to help her. So Jack wrote at Esther's dictation, and before they expected an answer, a letter came from Mrs. Barfield saying that she remembered Esther perfectly well. She had just returned from the south. She was all alone at Woodview, and wanted a servant. Esther could come and take the place if she liked. She enclosed £5, and hoped that the money would enable Esther to leave London at once. But this returning to former conditions filled Esther with strange trouble. Her heart beat as she recognized the spire of the church between the trees, and the undulating lines of downs behind the trees awakened painful recollections. She knew the white gate was somewhere in this plantation, but could not remember its exact position, and she took the road to the left instead of taking the road to the right, and had to retrace her steps. The gate had fallen from its hinge, and she had some difficulty in opening it. The lodge, where the blind gatekeeper used to play the flute, was closed. The park paling had not been kept in repair. Wandering sheep and cattle had worn away the great holly hedge, and Esther noticed that in falling an elm had broken through the garden wall. When she arrived at the iron gate under the bunched evergreens, her steps paused, for this was where she had met William for the first time. He had taken her through the stables and pointed out to her Silver Braid's box. She remembered the horses going to the downs, horses coming from the downs, stabling and the sound of hoofs everywhere. But now silence. She could see that many a roof had fallen, and that ruins of outhouses filled the yard. She remembered the kitchen windows bright in the setting sun, and the white-capped servants moving about the great white table. But now the shutters were up, nowhere a light, the knocker had disappeared from the door, and she asked herself how she was to get in. She even felt afraid. Supposing she should not find Mrs. Barfield? She made her way through the shrubbery, tripping over fallen branches and trunks of trees. Rooks rose out of the evergreens with a great clatter. Her heart stood still, and she hardly dared to tear herself through the mass of underwood. At last she gained the lawn, and, still very frightened, sought for the bell. The socket plate hung loose on the wire, and only a faint tinkle came through the solitude of the empty house. At last footsteps and a light. The chain door was opened a little, and a voice asked who it was. Esther explained. The door was opened, and she stood face to face with her old mistress. Mrs. Barfield stood holding the candle high, so that she could see Esther. Esther knew her at once. She had not changed very much. She kept her beautiful white teeth and her girlish smile. The pointed, vixen-like face had not altered in outline, but the reddish hair was so thin that it had to be parted on the side and drawn over the skull. Her figure was delicate and sprightly as ever. Esther noticed all this, and Mrs. Barfield noticed that Esther had grown stouter. Her face was still pleasant to see, for it kept that look of blunt, honest nature which had always been its charm. She was now the thick-set working woman of 40, and she stood holding the hem of her jacket in her rough hands. "We'd better put the chain up, for I'm alone in the house." "Aren't you afraid, ma'am?" "A little, but there's nothing to steal. I asked the policeman to keep a look-out. Come into the library." There was the round table, the little green sofa, the piano, the parrot's cage, and the yellow-painted presses, and it seemed only a little while since she had been summoned to this room, since she had stood facing her mistress, her confession on her lips. It seemed like yesterday, and yet 17 years and more had gone by. And all these years were now a sort of blur in her mind, a dream, the connecting links of which were gone, and she stood face to face with her old mistress in the old room. "You've had a cold journey, Esther. You'd like some tea?" "Oh, don't trouble, ma'am." "It's no trouble. I should like some myself. The fire's out in the kitchen. We can boil the kettle here." They went through the base door into the long passage. Mrs. Barfield told Esther where was the pantry, the kitchen, and the larder. Esther answered that she remembered quite well, and it seemed to her not a little strange that she should know these things. Mrs. Barfield said, "So you haven't forgotten Woodview, Esther?" "No, ma'am. It seems like yesterday. But I'm afraid the damp has got into the kitchen, ma'am. The range is that neglected." "Ah, Woodview isn't what it was." Mrs. Barfield told how she had buried her husband in the old village church. She had taken her daughter to Egypt. She had dwindled there till there was little more than a skeleton to lay in the grave. "Yes, ma'am. I know how it takes them, inch by inch. My husband died of consumption." They sat talking for hours. One thing led to another, and Esther gradually told Mrs. Barfield the story of her life from the day they bade each other good-bye in the room they were now sitting. "It's quite a romance, Esther." "It was a hard fight, and it isn't over yet, ma'am. It won't be over until I see him settled in some regular work. I hope I shall live to see him settled." They sat over the fire a long time without speaking. Mrs. Barfield said, "It must be getting on for bedtime." "I suppose it must, ma'am." She asked if she should sleep in the room she had once shared with Margaret Gale. Mrs. Barfield answered with a sigh that as all the bedrooms were empty, Esther had better sleep in the room next to hers. End of chapter 45. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 46 of Esther Waters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Esther Waters by George Moore. Chapter 46. Esther seemed to have quite naturally accepted Woodview as a final stage. Any further change in her life she did not seem to regard as possible or desirable. One of these days her boy would get settled. He would come down now and again to see her. She did not want any more than that. No, she did not find the place lonely. A young girl might, but she was no longer a young girl. She had her work to do, and when it was done she was glad to sit down to rest. And dressed in long cloaks, the women went for walks together. Sometimes they went up the hill, sometimes into Southwick to make some little purchases. On Sundays they walked to Beeding to attend meeting. And they came home along the winter roads, the peace and happiness of prayer upon their faces, holding their skirts out of the mud, unashamed of their common boots. They made no acquaintances, seeming to find in each other all necessary companionship. Their heads bent a little forward, they trudged home, talking of what they were in the habit of talking: that another tree had blown down, that Jack was now earning good money, 10 shillings a week. Esther hoped it would last. Or else Esther told her mistress that she had heard that one of Mr. Arthur's horses had won a race. He lived in the north of England, where he had a small training stable, and his mother never heard of him except through the sporting papers. "He hasn't been here for 4 years," Mrs. Barfield said. "He hates the place. He wouldn't care if I were to burn it down tomorrow. However, I do the best I can, hoping that one day he'll marry and come and live here." Mr. Arthur, that was how Mrs. Barfield and Esther spoke of him, did not draw any income from the estate. The rents only sufficed to pay the charges and the widow's jointure. All the land was let, the house he had tried to let, but it had been found impossible to find a tenant, unless Mr. Arthur would expend some considerable sum in putting the house and grounds into a state of proper repair. This he did not care to do. He said that he found race horses a more profitable speculation. Besides, even the park had been let on lease. Nothing remained to him but the house and lawn and garden. He could no longer gallop a horse on the hill without somebody's leave, so he didn't care what became of the place. His mother might go on living there, keeping things together, as she called it. He did not mind what she did as long as she didn't bother him. So did he express himself regarding Woodview on the rare occasion of his visits, and when he troubled to answer his mother's letters. Mrs. Barfield, whose thoughts were limited to the estate, was pained by his indifference. She gradually ceased to consult him, and when Beeding was too far for her walk, she had the furniture removed from the drawing room and a long deal table placed there instead. She had not asked herself if Arthur would object to her inviting a few brethren of the neighbourhood to her house for meeting, or publishing the meetings by notices posted on the lodge gate. One day Mrs. Barfield and Esther was walking in the avenue when, to their surprise, they saw Mr. Arthur open the white gate and come through. The mother hastened forward to meet her son, but paused dismayed by the anger that looked out of his eyes. He did not like the notices, and she was sorry that he was annoyed. She didn't think that he would mind them, and she hastened by his side pleading her excuses. But to her great sorrow Arthur did not seem to be able to overcome his annoyance. He refused to listen, and continued his reproaches, saying the things that he knew would most pain her. He did not care whether the trees stood or fell, whether the cement remained upon the walls or dropped from them. He didn't draw a penny of income from the place, and did not dare a damn what became of it. He allowed her to live there. She got her jointure out of the property, and he didn't want to interfere with her. But what he could not stand was the snuffy little folk from the town coming round his house. The Barfields at least were county, and he wished Woodview to remain county as long as the walls held together. He wasn't a bit ashamed of all this ruin. You could receive the Prince of Wales in a ruin, but he wouldn't care to ask him into a dissenting chapel. Mrs. Barfield answered that she didn't see how the mere assembling of a few friends in prayer could disgrace a house. She did not know that he objected to her asking them. She would not ask them any more. The only thing was that there was no place nearer than Beeding where they could meet, and she could no longer walk so far. She would have to give up meeting.
It seems to me a strange taste to want to kneel down with a lot of little shopkeepers. Is this where you kneel?
He said, pointing to the long deal table.
The place is a regular little Bethel.
Our Lord said that when a number should gather together for prayer, that he would be among them. Those are true words, and as we get old we feel more and more the want of this communion of spirit. It is only then that we feel that we really with God. The folk that you despise are equal in his sight, and living here alone, what should I be without prayer? And Esther, after her life of trouble and strife, what would she be without prayer? It's our consolation.
I think you could choose one's company for prayer as for everything else. Besides, what do you get out of it? Miracles don't happen nowadays.
You're very young, Arthur, and you cannot feel the want of prayer as we do. Two old women living in this lonely house. As age and solitude overtake us, the realities of life float away, and we become more and more sensible to the mystery which surrounds us. And our Lord Jesus Christ gave us love and prayer so that we might see a little further. An expression of great beauty came upon her face, that unconscious resignation which, like the twilight, hallows and transforms. In such moments the humblest hearts are at one with nature, and speaks out of the eternal wisdom of things. So even this common racing man was touched, and he said,
I'm sorry if I said anything to hurt your religious feelings.
Mrs. Barfield did not answer.
Do you not accept my apologies, mother?
My dear boy, what do I care for your apologies? What are they to me? All I think of now is your conversion to Christ. Nothing else matters. I shall always pray for that.
You may have whom you like up here. I don't mind if it makes you happy. I'm ashamed of myself. Don't let's say any more about it. I'm only down for the day. I'm going home tomorrow.
Home, Arthur? This is your home. I can't bear to hear you speak of any other place as your home.
Well, mother, then I shall say that I am going back to business tomorrow.
Mrs. Barfield sighed. End of chapter 46. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 47 of Esther Waters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Esther Waters by George Moore. Chapter 47. Days, weeks, months passed away, and the two women came to live more and more like friends, and less like mistress and maid. Not that Esther ever failed to use the respectful "ma'am" when she addressed her mistress, nor did they ever sit down to a meal at the same table. But these slight social distinctions, which habit naturally preserved, and which it would have been disagreeable to both to forego, were no check on the intimacy of their companionship. In the evening they sat in the library sewing, or Mrs. Barfield read aloud, or they talked of their sons. On Sundays they had their meetings. The folk came from quite a distance, and sometimes as many as 25 knelt round the deal table in the drawing room. And Esther felt that these days were the happiest of her life. She was content in the peaceful present, and she knew that Mrs. Barfield would not leave her unprovided for. She was almost free from anxiety. But Jack did not seem to be able to obtain regular employment in London, and her wages were so small that she could not help him much. So the sight of his handwriting made her tremble, and she sometimes did not show the letter to Mrs. Barfield for some hours after. One Sunday morning, after meeting, as the two women were going for their walk up the hill, Esther said, "I've a letter from my boy, ma'am. I hope it is to tell me that he's got back to work."
I'm afraid I shan't be able to read it, Esther. I haven't my glasses with me.
"It don't matter, ma'am. It'll keep."
Give it to me. His writing is large and legible. I think I can read it. My dear mother, the place I told you of in my last letter was given away, so I must go on in the toy shop till something better turns up. I only get 6 shillings a week and my tea, and can't quite manage on that. Then something, pay 3 and 6pence a week, something bed, something.
"I know, ma'am. He shares a bed with the eldest boy."
Yes, that's it, and he wants to know if you can help him. I don't like to trouble you, mother, but it is hard for a boy to get his living in London.
"But I've sent him all my money. I shan't have any till next quarter."
"I'll lend you some, Esther. We can't leave the boy to starve. He can't live on 2 and 6pence a week."
"You're very good, ma'am, but I don't like to take your money. We shan't be able to get the garden cleared this winter."
"We shall manage somehow, Esther. The garden must wait. The first thing to do is to see that your boy doesn't want for food."
The women resumed their walk up the hill. When they reached the top, Mrs. Barfield said,
"I haven't heard from Mr. Arthur for months. I envy you, Esther, those letters asking for a little money. What's the use of money to us except to give it to our children? Helping others, that is the only happiness."
At the end of the combe, under the shaws, stood the old red-tiled farmhouse in which Mrs. Barfield had been born. Beyond it downlands rolled on and on, reaching half-way up the northern sky. Mrs. Barfield was thinking of the days when her husband used to jump off his cob and walk beside her through those gorse patches on his way to the farmhouse. She had come from the farmhouse beneath the shaws to go to live in an Italian house sheltered by a fringe of trees. That was her adventure. She knew it, and she turned from the view of the downs to the view of the sea. The plantations of Woodview touched the horizon. Then the line dipped, and between the top branches of a row of elms appeared the roofs of the town. Over a long spider-legged bridge a train wriggled like a snake. The bleak river flowed into the harbour, and the shingle banks saved the low land from inundation. Then the train passed behind the square dogmatic tower of the village church. Her husband lay beneath the chancel. Her father, mother, all her relations lay in the churchyard. She would go up there in a few years. Her daughter lay far away in Egypt. Upon this downland all her life had been passed, all her life except the few months she had spent by her daughter's bedside in Egypt. She had come down from that combe, from that farmhouse beneath the shaws, and had only crossed the down. And this barren landscape meant as much to Esther as to her mistress. It was on these downs that she had walked with William. He had been born and bred on these downs, but he lay far away in Brompton Cemetery. It was she who had come back, and in her simple way she too wondered at the mystery of destiny. As they descended the hill, Mrs. Barfield asked Esther if she ever heard of Fred Parsons. "No, ma'am, I don't know what's become of him."
"And if you were to meet him again, would you care to marry him?"
"Marry? And begin life all over again? All the worry and bother over again? Why should I marry? All I live for now is to see my boy settled in life." The women walked on in silence, passing by long ruins of stables, coach houses, granaries, rickyards, all in ruin and decay. The women paused and went towards the garden, and removing some pieces of the broken gate, they entered a miniature wilderness. The espalier apple trees had disappeared beneath climbing weeds, and long briars had shot out from the bushes, leaving few traces of the former walks, a damp, dismal place that the birds seemed to have abandoned. Of the greenhouse only some broken glass and a black broken chimney remained. A great elm had carried away a large portion of the southern wall, and under the dripping trees an aged peacock screamed for his lost mate.
"I don't suppose that Jack will be able to find any more paying employment this winter. We must send him 6 shillings a week. That with what he's earning will make 12. He'll be able to live nicely on that."
"I should think he would indeed. But then, what about the wages of them who was to have cleared the garden for us?"
"We shan't be able to get the whole garden cleared, but Jim will be able to get a piece ready for us to sow some spring vegetables. Not a large piece, but enough for us. The first thing to do will be to cut down those apple trees. I'm afraid we shall have to cut down that walnut. Nothing could grow beneath it. Did anyone ever see such a mass of weed and briar? Yes, it is only about 10 years since we left Woodview, and the garden was let run to waste. Nature does not take long, a few years, a very few years."
End of chapter 47. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 48 of Esther Waters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Esther Waters by George Moore. Chapter 48. All the winter the north wind roamed on the hills. Many trees fell in the park, and at the end of February Woodview seemed barer and more desolate than ever. Broken branches littered the roadway, and the tall trunks showed their wounds. The women sat over their fire in the evening listening to the blast, cogitating the work that awaited them as soon as the weather showed signs of breaking. Mrs. Barfield had laid by a few pounds during the winter, and the day that Jim cleared out the first piece of espalier trees she spent entirely in the garden, hardly able to take her eyes off him. But the pleasure of the day was in a measure spoiled for her by the knowledge that on that day her son was riding in the great steeplechase. She was full of fear for his safety. She did not sleep that night, and hurried down at an early hour to the garden to ask Jim for the newspaper which she had told him to bring her. He took some time to extract the paper from his torn pocket.
"He isn't in the first three," said Mrs. Barfield. "I always know that he is safe if he's in the first three. We must turn to the account of the race to see if there were any accidents."
She turned over the paper.
"Thank God he is safe," she said. "His horse ran fourth."
"You worry yourself without cause, ma'am. A good rider like him don't meet with accidents."
"The best riders are often killed, Esther. I never have any easy moment when I hear he's going to ride in these races. Supposing one day I were to read that he was carried back on a shutter."
"We mustn't let our thoughts run on such things, ma'am. If a war was to break out tomorrow, what should I do? His regiment would be ordered out. It is sad to think that he had to enlist. But, as he said, he couldn't go on living on me any longer, poor boy. We must keep on working, doing the best we can for them. There are all sorts of chances, and we can only pray that God may spare them."
"Yes, Esther, that's all we can do. Work on to the end. But your boy is coming to see you today."
"Yes, ma'am. He'll be here by 12 o'clock."
"You're luckier than I am. I wonder if I shall ever see my boy again."
"Yes, ma'am, of course you will. He'll come back to you right enough one of these days. There's a good time coming, that's what I always says. And now I've got work to do in the house. Are you going to stop here, or are you coming in with me? It'll do you no good standing about in the wet clay." Mrs. Barfield smiled and nodded, and Esther paused at the broken gate to watch her mistress, who stood superintending the clearing away of 10 years' growth of weeds, as much interested in the prospect of a few peas and cabbages as in former days she had been in the culture of expensive flowers. She stood on what remained of a gravel walk, the heavy clay clinging to her boots, watching Jim piling weeds upon his barrow. Would he be able to finish the plot of ground by the end of the week? What should they do with that grey walnut tree? Nothing would grow underneath it. Jim was afraid that he would not be able to cut it down and remove it without help. Mrs. Barfield suggested sawing away some of the branches, but Jim was not sure that the expedient would prove of much avail. In his opinion, the tree took all the goodness out of the soil, and that while it stood they could not expect a very great show of vegetables. Mrs. Barfield asked if the sale of the tree trunk would indemnify her for the cost of cutting it down. Jim paused in his work, and leaning on his spade, considered if there was any one in the town who for the sake of the timber would cut the tree down and take it away for nothing. There ought to be some such person in town, if it came to that. Mrs. Barfield ought to receive something for the tree. Walnut was a valuable wood, was extensively used by cabinet makers, and so on, until Mrs. Barfield begged him to get on with his digging. At 12 o'clock Esther and Mrs. Barfield walked out on the lawn. A loud wind came up from the sea, and it shook the evergreens as if it were angry with them. A rook carried a stick to the tops of the tall trees, and the women drew their cloaks about them. The train passed across the vista, and the women wondered how long it would take Jack to walk from the station. Then another rook stooped to the edge of the plantation, gathered a twig, and carried it away. The wind was rough. It caught the evergreens underneath and blew them out like umbrellas. The grass had not yet begun to grow, and the grey sea harmonized with the grey-green land. The women waited on the windy lawn, their skirts blown against their legs, keeping their hats on with difficulty. It was too cold for standing still. They turned and walked a few steps towards the house, and then looked round. A tall soldier came through the gate. He wore a long red cloak, and a small cap jauntily set on the side of his close-clipped head. Esther uttered a little exclamation, and ran to meet him. He took his mother in his arms, kissed her, and they walked towards Mrs. Barfield together. All was forgotten in the happiness of the moment, the long fight for his life, and the possibility that any moment might declare him to be mere food for powder and shot. She was only conscious that she had accomplished her woman's work. She had brought him up to man's estate, and that was her sufficient reward. What a fine fellow he was! She did not know he was so handsome, and blushing with pleasure and pride, she glanced shyly at him out of the corners of her eyes as she introduced him to her mistress. "This is my son, ma'am." Mrs. Barfield held out her hand to the young soldier.
"I have heard a great deal about you from your mother." "And I of you, ma'am. You've been very kind to my mother. I don't know how to thank you."
And in silence they walked towards the house. End of chapter 48, and end of the book Esther Waters by George Moore. Read by Lars Rolander. Thank you for listening.